First of all, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you in Barcelona, and also hi to everybody looking from home. I'm Jurgen Goossens. I'm Associate Professor Public Law, Constitutional Law and Administrative Law at the Tilburg University. And I'm very honored and happy that I'm asked here on the center stage to also give you perspective, a public law perspective, a rule of law perspective. And in this keynote, I will travel with you. And we will travel from a well-known concept, the rule of law, to a concept known for a few decades, the rule of code, and we will go back. And the main message of my keynote will be that when we reflect on technological innovation and blockchain applications in governance, that we will always have to go back and forth between the rule of law, the foundations of the rule of law, and the rule of code. I am the project leader of a project called Chain. It's of course a wink to blockchain, but we also have a broader perspective. And it's a perspective that humankind is connected. We are all connected through algorithms and information networks. And blockchain, of course, is a prime example of that connectedness between humankind through algorithms and information networks. We will start from the rule of law perspective. And the rule of law is foundational. The rule of law means that the legal frameworks and the principles of democracy and the rule of law should be followed by us citizens. But more importantly, also the government is bound by its own legal rules. That is the rule of law. But when we look at the rule of law, we often just say democracy, the principle of legality, the right to go to a judge, but we lose sight of the fact that our society is evolving tremendously. And when we look from the rule of law, we have to make sure that we take into account that our society is hyper-complex and hyper-connected. This means that we have to look at least three important dynamics. Dynamic number one is multi-level governance. When we govern from different levels of government. That means the local, the regional, the national, the level of the European Union, and even the global level. And unpermissioned public blockchains, for instance, they cut through all these layers. That brings complexity, that brings challenges for regulators to try to capture and regulate what's happening. Secondly, network governance. Network governance has been around for many decades, but increasingly, and thanks to blockchain, that network governance is not only autonomously to a certain extent, but also digital. So in a digital network governance context, we have public actors and private actors working together. And the public sphere and the private sphere are increasingly and more blurred. The private sphere has been constitutionalized by human rights, and the public sphere has been privatized to a certain extent by letting private actors participate in governing. Thirdly, one could say that we are entering or in the middle of the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is a new anthropological era where humankind, where we dominate the earth, where we leave a footprint that is almost irreversible. Think, for instance, about climate change. That means that the connectedness between human, earth, but also technology, also machines, because our footprint is being enlarged enormously by technology, potentially also by blockchain, is a very important dynamic to look at. So from this perspective, we should try to follow the presentation further on. In my research, I try to look from a constitutional resilience perspective. And resilience of the constitutional order, the legal order, I define it as the ability of the legal order to cope with, to deal with transformations in our society. Also digital transformations, such as blockchain, which might bring a lot of opportunities, but also risks and challenges to the rule of law, to our constitutional framework. And this relation between the constitutional legal order and these digital transformations is a reflexive relation. Innovations like blockchain might also challenge and even transform the rule of law framework as we know it, which might also be a good thing. So when you take a rule of law, constitutional law perspective, I believe and I think and hope you will agree with me that it's very important that we look at it from a compliance by design perspective, that we go further than to check whether the privacy regulation is fine, that there is privacy by design. Legal compliance by design should go much further and should potentially also guarantee important public values like transparency and accountability, participation, etc. There was a rule of law. Let's now go to the rule of code. For decades, human beings have tried to translate rules, legal rules, into code. There's nothing new. But blockchain brings the rule of law to the next level, I believe. Because blockchain brings us an autonomous mode of code-based rules, an autonomous mode of regulation by code. Because in a blockchain network, ideally, people can make transactions with each other without a trusted third party, potentially without a government that is there to uphold important rule of law principles. And when smart contracts are being put in the mix with blockchain, I believe that the possibilities of turning law into code are increasing enormously. I do think that there is a future with enormous possibilities and challenges, especially also with regard to the rule of law. Smart contracts, as you know, they enable the automatic execution and enforcement of rules and transactions. And smart contracts typically have three functions. One, the registration of information that can no longer be tampered with. Two, the exchange of value, or at least the representation of value via tokenization. And three, the execution of rules. And after collective verification, there is an automatic execution and enforcement of these rules and transactions without the need of a trusted intermediary, especially and most importantly in unpermissioned public blockchains. When we look at this picture of blockchain-based smart contracts, we need to take into account when we are using blockchain for innovation of public governance that there is a very important distinction to be made. And this symbol represents the interaction between humankind and technology. What can we give to machine-readable computer systems, and what should still be done by human beings? Well, in public governance, you then have to make an important distinction between, on the one hand, there's a little bit of a backlog here, but it will be fine. On the one hand, discretionary powers. If in a certain domain there is still room for interpretation, for applying the legal rules to a specific case, given all the facts and circumstances, that's something different than a domain with circumscribed powers, where there is actually only one decision to be made. For instance, when you meet all these criteria, you should, and you have the right to get a government subsidy, for instance. Well, in the case of a circumscribed power, where there is no room for discretion, I believe it's an ideal situation to try to apply rule-based smart contracts and the automatic execution and enforcement of certain rules. However, in domains with discretionary powers, it is much more difficult to apply rigidly if A then B algorithms, smart contracts, because the room for discretion is being guided in the rule of law framework by principles of good administration, due diligence, reason giving, the right for citizens to be heard. That's of course difficult to match with a rigid application of algorithms. That's important to take into account. We went from the rule of law to the rule of code, and now I will make the recommendation that we should go back and forth between the rule of law and the rule of code. The question is, of course, how and what does that mean? Well, I believe that blockchain could have tremendous innovations in public governance and the rule of law. Think about elections, for instance. There are a lot of opportunities for blockchains to secure the fairness of elections and the monitoring of voting. On the other hand, there are also enormous challenges. Think about cryptocurrencies, for instance, due to which you might evade political campaign financing rules, thereby putting the rule of law and the trust in voting procedures under a lot of pressure. So this means we should try to embrace the opportunities, but also mitigate the risks for the rule of law. Because that rule of law might indeed be under pressure based on decentralized, distributed, blockchain-based applications. Think, for instance, about human rights. Human rights such as privacy. There are important discussions, also legal discussions, on when a blockchain solution might or might not be compliant with the GDPR. Secondly, under Article 6 and 13 of the European Convention of Human Rights, you have the right to a fair trial. And you have the right to an effective remedy. So that means that even after the automatic execution and enforcement of rules and transactions, you as a citizen still has the right to go to a judge who should be able to overturn the decisions automatically made based on a blockchain application, especially when we are talking about public tasks and the enforcement and execution of public authority, which could be done by governments, but which could also be done by private parties. Remember what I said, that there's a blurred distinction between private and public spheres. So the rule of law might be under pressure. However, the rule of law is a concept known for many years, but I believe that blockchain-based smart contracts also bring new opportunities to the rule of law. And let me finish with this slide. There is an increased attention in the past years towards the concept of rules as code. So for a long time, humankind has tried to put law and regulation into code because it would be tremendously labor intensive for humankind to try to implement all the legal rules we have. So we need algorithms, we need computer systems. And a new way of going forward could be that the democratically accountable and elected legislator, which is an important part of the rule of law, actually works together with software developers to reflect and to think which type and which kind of legislation should not just be published in natural human language, but could also automatically be implemented in code, officially published code. So that means that in the future, part of our legislation could be in natural human language that we can interpret, that we can talk about, but also in code that is, one, machine readable, and it is also actionable by machine-based systems. So potentially, blockchain might create new opportunities for going from the rule of law to the rule of code by taking into account, by design, the legal principles that we value and on which we have an impact by electing our democratic legislator. I believe that it's very important that when we teach blockchain at high schools, at universities, that we take into account all these different perspectives. The technical perspective, but also the science and technology perspective, the philosophical perspective. Think, for instance, about digital literacy. And thirdly, and most importantly, but that's not true, of course, I'm biased in that regard, also the legal angle. But when we look from a legal angle, from a rule of law angle to blockchain, it's important that we actually go further than what lawyers have learned in the schools that they went to 5 years ago, 15 years ago, or 35 years ago. Because the important principles of the rule of law, such as the right to go to a judge, or the separation of powers, or the fact that human rights should always be guaranteed, that is an important framework that is an important framework that is establishing constitutional resilience, resilience of our order to try to deal with innovations and threats in our society, but that we are open to a new perspective, that we are open to the perspective that innovation, and in this case, innovation by blockchain, could actually also transform the core understanding of what we have all learned about the rule of law. So within the rule of law, one of the core cornerstones is that rules, legislative rules, are made by the legislator that is held accountable by elections. But maybe we should add that in the future, and given the enormous increase of digitization, the democratically elected legislator should start working together with software developers to turn law into code without unintended consequences. So my main message is, let's go back and forth between the rule of law and the rule of code, and let's try that these two concepts can be combined and could actually strengthen each other to try to achieve the goal of this conference, which is democracy for all, blockchain for governance. Thank you.